talk, which I'm going to present or going to speak to today, is on the basis of a book which I completed over the course of about 9 years. It was a long time in the making, probably too long, but a book which, when I began research on the idea of looking at intermediaries, at what in the last few years have become known as human traffickers, seemed to be quite an arcane or rather minor interest subject area. Referring to the idea of recruiters seemed to be something which was perhaps of minor interest in early modern history. And then, as can happen, the world catches up with you, and the reality of the situation that took place perhaps beginning in 2009, in part the long outplay of events. Like everything in history, we can go back and back and back in time to explain the origins of them, but in particular beginning with the outplay of the Arab Spring, world economic crises after 2008-9, and then the consequent impacts on the Levant, on Greater Syria, and the movement of people from that area, sometimes called a refugee crisis, but really a type of crisis brought about by lots of other political events too. So in the beginning, it was quite common for me to need to explain what it was I was doing. And I think now, particularly in the German context, words like Schlepper, Schleuser, organizer, all of these things have become much more common because of the movement of as many as 1.8 million people in the Mediterranean world in the last 5-6 years, and the ongoing movement of peoples more generally. But what I'm particularly interested in this book is the early modern dimensions of that idea of study. And I'm particularly interested in how one, if you like, ethnic community, one linguistic community, German speakers, moved both east and west during this period of time. And I focus on Germans, just by way of further background, because they are the largest migratory people in the period between the 1640s and the end of the 18th century, the largest migratory community of people moving outside of imperial systems. Spanish-speaking migrants go to the Spanish Americas, British and Irish moved to parts of the British colonial world and so on. Germans became in effect a free market of labor, and as such were recruited for other people's imperial systems, or as I'm going to suggest today, too, became involved in a form of intra-European colonization after the recession of the Ottoman Empire in southeastern Europe, beginning in 1683, 1699, 1718 with the Peace of Passarowitz. So this study, in a way, is not there just yet. Let's stay with where we were, if I can do that. Sorry, it's moved a little bit too far. Let's stay there for a moment. Selling Souls, Trafficking German Migrants, Europe and America, then is a book that tries to consider the movement of German speakers in continental Europe and across the Atlantic in the period 1648 to 1780, with a particular focus on the migrant recruiters who tempted migrants and who organized their traffic. Now, in our century, as I've said, these people are classically known as human traffickers, and the political situation and economic importance of populating territories, as you see on this map of the vast movement of Europeans into North America, displacing indigenous peoples. This political and economic importance of populating territories has long been identified as a key component of early modern political thought. Nonetheless, the actual process of migrant recruitment, which took place within German-speaking Europe and which was crucial to populating these societies, has largely hitherto been overlooked. My study then explores that neglected region between the homely and the familiar, the enticing and the foreign, between the Heimat and the Wanderlust, investigating the actions of migrant recruiters who solicited and enticed and subsequently trafficked migrants. Simultaneously, these individuals, and I'm approaching this not simply as an economic historian, I'm a soft economic historian, if you like, by training a cultural historian and having succeeded incredibly to the position of Peter Burke, interested in the social dimensions and the cultural dimensions of these stories. Simultaneously then, these individuals were seducers, they were advisors, they were cajolers, and they were men and women who were responsible for the systemization of migration throughout the early modern period. Through their actions, I argue in this book, the circum-Atlantic and ultimately global competition for colonial labor, and specifically German labor, wrought significant changes in the European labor market and catalyzed state-sponsored, professionalized control of immigration, in turn irrevocably changing state policy towards migrants. So the processes, I argue, that traffickers initiated in the 17th and 18th centuries would have large, long-lasting effects on large-scale migration in the 19th and 20th centuries and even beyond. So further by way of background. This is the area that I'm working on, and this map is a map I've compiled over these years of every place in German-speaking Europe in which one of my recruiters operated, was either arrested for attempting to organize people or successfully organized migrants to leave between the periods 1648 and 1780. So each one of these places I have worked on archivally as well to look at these individuals in this process. By way of perhaps extended background, I would say that migrants are generally in the historical narrative of early modern Europe presented as being either pariahs or egoists. They're individuals, as in this early 20th century quotation from the French, are individuals not to be trusted. They're the outsider. They're those individuals that challenge set norms. And that was also the case, it should be said, in the 15th into the 16th and 17th centuries. And that's particularly true as a result of the religious invectives, religious instructions given. And I hope my check is correct here from what I could find. It's the longest time I've spent searching in Bibles for a long time for various quotations. But religious instructions, in particular the two German, bleibe im Land und nähre dich redlich, stay at home and verily you shall be fed. These two texts were used repeatedly throughout Central Europe in the 16th, 17th and 18th centuries to discourage people from leaving home. Yet I would argue it was travelers of all kinds, and if we observe the writings of a German demographic historian, Georg Fertig, he argues that in this early modern period, 1500 to 1800, 20 million Europeans technically constituted themselves as migrants because the density of small states in Central Europe meant that individuals, sometimes crossing 5 kilometers, left one state and entered another. That this notion of migration was one that was ontologically transgressive, that individuals brought with them new information, challenged pre-existing understandings, and that exiles, fugitives, captives, all of these individuals helped to make the distance and the distant a more familiar place. Generally then, travel in early modern Europe was seen as something that could threaten and could promise in and of the same time. And it could, as I said, be ontologically transgressive by challenging established categories. Travel, in turn, encouraged curiosity. We could think here of the work of Justin Stagel and his history of early modern curiosity. Travel encouraged curiosity, and curiosity encouraged travel. This was a breach from the late medieval idea of the peregrinatio anima, of those individuals who were entitled to move, being in religious orders or being nobles. This was the new beginning of an interest towards movement on the part of all in society, and as such, it was seen as dangerous. So from about the late 15th century, just about, populations in Europe became surprisingly mobile for a whole variety of reasons. And as a result, not just with demographic decline, with warfare and disease, the movement towards city life and the growth of further urban conurbations, but a large number of individuals began to transgress environments, and European states came to prohibit migration by encouraging populations to be sedentary and to commit to the idea of a registered domicile. Increasingly, we're moving towards the system more familiar to us in the French first and then in other European contexts of having a registered permanent place of abode. For those individuals who were refusing to do so from the mid and third quarter of the 17th century onwards, they faced official and sometimes religious sanction. And this led, and I'm moving through this quickly because in my mind this is still background to the stories I'm about to tell you, if you'll allow me. This led to the development in much of German-speaking Europe of new theories and practice of Populierung, from the French concept already in the late 16th century, but this idea of Populierung began to fuse with ideas of cameralist economics, connected with new economic theories. And this concept of population, in the Habsburg lands increasingly known as impopulatio, impopulation. And I'll return to why I think Habsburg officials, Viennese officials in particular, prefer to use that term than Populierung. This was a new form of rational management of all areas of society through an enlightened bureaucratization of all branches of administration. En bref, what was happening was a fixation on the idea of controlling one's population. And to do so, one needed to commit to a system of esprit géométrique, as it's been described by Christopher Bailey in his History of Early Modern Europe, to come to know the land and to come to know the individuals living on it. So a new, rational, quasi-enlightened, informed understanding of society which fixated on the idea of populations. And this now led to a re-enlivenment of earlier practices of recruitment. On the one hand, demographic increase after 1648. On another hand, the growth of individuals seeking better opportunities working on the land or moving from one situation of enserfment to another. And then this growing sense of bureaucratization on the part of the state seeking to actually control the movement of people. What that led to was the emergence of new understandings of legal and illegal migrant recruitment, states organizing individuals to recruit on their part, to round up people, and then individuals working for the free market, and in particular for Dutch shipping companies, to move people illegally out of Europe across the Atlantic world. And this was now because there was an emerging so-called rabies Carolina that began to take hold in much of Central Europe, beginning first in the ports of the Low Countries in the 1680s, and gradually spreading down the Rhine into the various river systems, riparian systems working off the Rhine and its tributaries. We had this disease of desire, this fever of moving to the Americas that was spreading and encouraging many thousands to leave. But historically, again, as I said, migration was illegal, except if one could prove that one moved under one of four categories. Hopefully that is the slide that is behind me. Otherwise, I have lost track of where I am. I have lost track of where I am. Forgive me. Let's stay with that one. Populierung and rational management. Forgive me. What that meant was that these four categories of organization, as increasingly challenged by these German writers, as mentioned here below, beginning with people like Conring, but Seckendorf, von Pfeiffer, and many others, these German cameralists and writers at court began to really influence the way people were thinking about control of population. And this meant in turn that we had a new commitment to the idea of control. Okay? Forgive me if that was too boring. Let me see where we are with this. Good. What this meant was that, and now the story begins, I hope. By the end of the 17th century, recruiters, these individuals in whom I'm particularly interested, began to emerge in a form and of a style not really seen since the High Middle Ages, particularly in the 1100s, 1200s. And at that time, these individuals were known as locatores. Locatores are mentioned already in Tacitus and in earlier texts in the Roman context, but these were individuals recruited themselves and sent out into the landscape to try and drum up, trommel, communities, particularly farming individuals, to come with them and establish new settlements. In the 1100s and 1200s, locatores had worked for the Teutonic Knights, the Knights of St. John of Jerusalem, for the settlement of new German lands in the Baltic, but also in parts of Upper Hungary. And then throughout the early modern period, the 1400s into the 1500s, these similar individuals appear as military recruiters. So classically, in much of our Central European literature, they appear with drummers, they appear as musicians, and others, in the German expression, nach dem Pfeifer spielen, to follow the piper, to follow those individuals who come attracting you out of the community. After the 30 Years' War, a new iteration or a new variation of these individuals begins to appear. And throughout Europe, we see these names being used. In German and Dutch, we have Seelenverkäufer, Zielverkäufers, Menschenfänger, Volkshauders, Menschenverderber, Menschendiebe, Spitzbuben, and a whole variety of different terms used for these. And what they did, in simple terms, was open a line of credit for a recruited individual who would then be taken free of charge from his, and typically in the first instance they were men, taken from his village along a river system to a Dutch port, where they were then enlisted in either the VOC, the Dutch East India Company, or the WIC, the Dutch West India Company. And what takes place is ultimately a fusion between the desire of individuals to leave and a market system which is emerging, run initially out of the Dutch ports to transport these individuals with them. So who were they, in brief? Who were these soul sellers? Well, human traffickers, as I've said, and migrant recruiters were not unique to the history of early modern German migration, but Germans were the most migratory of European peoples in the early modern period, traveling to areas where they were not part of their colonial or imperial possessions. Spanish migrants, as I suggested, moved to Spanish America, the English to New England, and even some relatively small European states like Sweden had their terra nova in the Americas. But Germans did not, and those who did not move internally between the German lands were largely recruited for resettlement abroad. These recruiters, Werber, in the military sense, had long played then a part in inspiring Germans and others to consider uprooting and leaving their homelands. And I'm using German to refer to individuals who spoke the language rather than some proto-national sense. So as I tried to set out in the book, I compare the role of migrant recruiters working to move German speakers to America, where in this period 120,000 Germans were moved between the late 1600s and 1780, and to look at German settlement in Hungary and other parts of South Central and Southeastern Europe, where almost 850,000 Germans moved in the same time. So I'm looking at the movement of close to 1 million German speakers. Over 100,000, as I say, across the Atlantic, perhaps better known, and then over 750,000, well over that, into Southeastern Europe, particularly occupying parts of reconquest Ottoman Southeastern Europe. The Banat, the Bachka, Bukovina, Vojvodina as it is today, basically historic Kingdom of Hungary territories. Only, I think, by uncovering the roles of traffickers in these earlier centuries can we get a complete picture of their standing in society in the later period, and indeed, I would argue, can we understand the history of Southeastern Europe in the 19th century and thereafter. So in the 12th and something has happened, but nevertheless, you're not missing too much. These are the 4 contexts in which individuals were permitted to move in the German lands in the 17th century and thereafter. If they were leaving unencumbered tendencies, if they would pay what was called a Gabella Immigrationis, or a manumission, sometimes called an Abzugsteuer, a departure tax in German. The third, if they paid this tax but needed to return to the previous lord's estate to perform robots or service work. And fourthly, if typically in exchanges of marriage, the so-called Gegenwechsel, where lords, neighboring lords, would exchange serfs for purposes of marriage. And this was the Gabella that was frequently known, and that meant that individuals moved either in positions of freedom or unfreedom. So these are the individuals I'm talking about. In the 12th and 13th centuries, locatores, as I've mentioned already, or colonist recruiters, were sent to work on behalf of private landowners and religious orders to recruit and settle farmers and tradesmen in the German Baltic states, but also here in Bohemia, Silesia, in Poland, and in Brandenburg. And locatores, in the Latin tradition, were persons who founded a new village or town for a king, for a bishop, or for a monastery, and their task was to persuade others to clear and settle the land. In return, locatores were typically rewarded with a gift of free land, with economic rights or prerequisites, and also frequently with judgeships or becoming mayor in the village where they settled. These individuals then, by the centuries I've mentioned, come to be known in this context as Volkhouders or Seelenverkäufers. And to many German migrants seeking to move to the Dutch lands, they were little more than slave traders. Many texts in the late 17th century refer to them as such. From the late 17th century onwards then, these recruiters, many of whom were also women and tavern keepers, worked for merchants and shipping companies along the Rhine and Danube rivers and in most Dutch ports. By the early 18th century, all along here, by the early 18th century, they had adapted their activities to accommodate the large number of German, Rhineland, and Swiss immigrants arriving in the Low Countries and seeking transportation across the Atlantic to England and eventually on to North America. These the principal ports of settlement. So my book is organized chronologically, and from the period following the end of the 30 Years' War down to the French Revolution, ending then just before both steam power and the bureaucratic state altered the flow of migrants into the 19th century system with which we're more familiar. As a result of this development of a new market-led system of migration, both the German state will legally define what constitutes a migrant in the early 19th century, but the United States in 1821 will also introduce for the first time restrictions on individuals entering the state. A new bureaucratic age comes about as a result of these earlier migrants. So building chronologically in my book, I chart the flow of migrants to Hungary, to North America, to Denmark, again in the mid and late 18th century to Hungary and to Russia, through the stories of these traffickers. They lay at the heart of the story I tell. Stories that I've reconstructed by piecing together the international careers of these individuals. So I'd like to offer you two examples. On the 9th of September 1749, the ship Francis and Elizabeth lay at anchor in the cove below the city of Philadelphia. The sloop had sailed from Rotterdam via the Isle of Wight and the port of Cowes, and it was one of 25 ships to arrive in the harbor of Philadelphia that year, 1749, together carrying some 7,000 German migrants to North America. Early on the morning of the 11th of September, two physicians from the city visited the ship and found that the crew and the passengers aboard the Francis and Elizabeth were unhealthy, quote, laboring under an eruptive fever, which the doctors assured the provincial council was infectious, the type of ship they sailed on. And these ships were frequently former slaving vessels that were outfitted to carry migrants across the Atlantic. And perhaps what's worth saying is that mortality rates on transatlantic slave vessels were lower than mortality rates on vessels carrying Germans, because Germans were cheaper than African slaves, okay, at this time. So mortality rates on African slave vessels in the mid and second half of the 18th century moved between 8 and 11 or 8 and 12%, according to David Eltis, and on these German vessels were frequently as high as 18% at the time. So the sight of yet another ship overcrowded with migrants caused the council in Philadelphia immense concern. Lieutenant Governor James Hamilton ordered the ship's captain to raise sail and, quote, remove his vessel to the mouth of the Schuylkill River as near to the plague house or the lazaretto as he could conveniently lie, and, quote, not to suffer any person to go near the ship except doctors, nurses, and servants. So with that, the ship raised anchor and sailed away from the harbor, and the hundreds of migrants aboard, there were 503 people aboard, like the very record of the ship first docking, disappeared from sight and memory. The migrants were never heard from again. So they didn't reach the pest house, they did not disembark somewhere else. It's not clear if they attempted to return, but the ship itself actually disappears from the register. Now, not quite everyone overlooked the migrants' plight. One local tavern keeper, Leonard Melchior, who had arrived in the city of Philadelphia from Germany in October 1732, and whose tavern close to the waterfront was a favorite with recently arrived migrants, was written by what he had seen to write of his concerns. Recalling his own journey just 17 years earlier, and witnessing now with shock and condemnation the dire situation of these new poor German migrants arriving, he penned a letter under the nom de plume LM and dispatched it to Germany, where on the instruction of Karl Eugen II, the Duke of Württemberg, it was published with great speed. Okay, so a Philadelphia tavern keeper sees the distress of these poor migrants, writes. His letter, which was originally sent back to relatives, is taken by a local head of state, the Duke of Württemberg, and is going to be used in a propaganda campaign to stop people moving. The primary purpose of Melchior's text was to discourage and indeed plead with Germans to at all costs avoid engaging the services of a Seelenverkäufer, of a trafficker, whom he, like many contemporaries in his text labeled a Neuländer, a Newlander, the speculators in human trafficking, whose crucial role, he said in his text, enabled immigration and caused the deaths of so many migrants. Now, Melchior's opprobrium for these characters, at whose feet he placed responsibility for the recently arrived overcrowded ships, calls out from his text, the wohlmeinende Nachricht, wie sich die Deutsche, die nach Pennsylvanien reisen wollen, zu verhalten haben, or the well-meant information as to how the Germans who wish to travel to Pennsylvania should conduct themselves, acknowledged that no words would stymie the tide of migrants seeking a new life in America. And I quote, "When an illness is not to be cured," he wrote, "the physician, the doctor, is accustomed to prescribe only such medicine as will serve the patients to alleviate their misery. Since the desire to go to Pennsylvania is so deeply rooted in the people of Germany, it can no longer be dug out, and although many weighty reasons can be adduced to cure them of it, only a relief measure can be suggested." So his text describes migration as a disease spreading throughout the land, and that doctors can try and cure it, can try to address it, but they're not going to stop it. It's not going to go away. And he argues in the text that the disease is being spread by traffickers, by Newlanders, who are causing people to leave. So fearing that there was little to dissuade those migrants who wanted to leave the Heimat, Melchior continued to offer advice on how to organize the journey, avoiding the actions of traffickers and Newlanders. And he said to cut the expense down, they should avoid doing this at any cost. The activities of the Newlander, he wrote, as on this quotation, have not only fallen into suspicion abroad, but right here in Pennsylvania, he, the trafficker, is held in the utmost contempt, because people are aware that so many scoundrels have deceived the immigrants, have even stolen all of their property, and that there are very few honorable people amongst these fellows, that we truly believe, dear fellow countrymen, that you are even less clever if you accept their invitation to come. Avoid at all costs the Newlander. It is an evil, and if you can find any other way to get here, do so or do not come at all. And then Melchior gives a final warning. Know then that this year, 1749, about 2,000 people were cast into the sea, many hundreds tricked by these new land agents out of their property, and that this very minute many others are dying miserably in boats lying off the city for want of hunger, thirst, and cold, since they must remain in the harbour because they have not paid their transportation and no one comes to release them. Those then who wish to travel here by the Rhine boats should have nothing to do with these Newlanders. And he goes on to explain that there's one individual aboard the vessel. I'm not going to take you through more, but here the Neuländer Elsasser, die arme Elsasser, the poor Alsatians, sind meistens von ihrem Neuländer VDW angeführt worden. That they are being tricked and moved, these poor Alsatians, by the Newlander VDW. Now, like the Francis and Elizabeth, I said there were many other vessels that landed in Pennsylvania that year, in Philadelphia, and all of them were carrying migrants from the Rhineland, from the Swiss cantons, from Alsace and Hanau, Württemberg, from Nassau and the Palatinate, Basel, Darmstadt, Odenwald, Trier, Mannheim, Swabia, Franconia and Zweibrücken, from all over the German southwest, and they came in their thousands. Most of them then sought this new life, but one of them aboard the vessel who signed the register on departure was Valentin Weber, who was this Newlander agent who himself had crossed the Atlantic 6 times by 1749, escorting perhaps as many as 5,000 Germans, moving them. Now, what I can describe about Weber, as I can with many of others, is that by looking at his routes back and forth across the Atlantic, bearing in mind that the shortest crossing is 35 days, the longest is 90, this man spends the better part of 2 decades moving back and forth, and intriguingly, on every occasion, has his mother with him, because his mother assures people that he's a safe person to travel with. Except Valentin Weber's mother had died before his first trip. So he has a new mother with him every time he does this. Now, in exactly the same month, but some 7,000 kilometers away, in Vienna, another report of a group of German migrants struggling to make their way to a new land reached the imperial court in the Residenzstadt. On the 6th of October, 1749, Magdalena Wagner submitted a statement to the court in Vienna outlining her journey from near Bayreuth to Temeswar in Hungary, a journey of over 1,000 kilometers by land and by water. Magdalena Wagner was a single woman in her early 20s, and she traveled with 8 families from her home, 26 people in all, hoping to join up with her parents who had left for Hungary at Eastertide the previous year. Like the many other tens and hundreds of thousands of migrants who had made their way to the lands to the east of the German Empire that year, Wagner and her fellow migrants were escorted by a trafficker who had freshly returned from Hungary and who promised to escort them by land and river all the way to southern Hungary. The group walked first of all to Regensburg, where they were then put aboard riverboats, the so-called Ulmer Schachtel, these boxes of Ulm, where they traveled further to Vienna. Now, in the first decades of the 18th century, when German migrants start to move to Hungary, it's much cheaper and easier to walk rather than taking the river routes. But the Rebus Carolina became so important that in villages, Germans would say, "But you sail to America." And so the agents in Vienna started to divert the migrants to riverways so that they could put them on boats to sail them to America. And in 1726, under Charles VI, they renamed part of the Banat America. True. There, in Vienna, the migrants disembarked and continued their onward journey to Hungary by foot. The trip was arduous and exhausting, and not helped by the incessant badgering of rival traffickers all along the banks of the river, who tried to tempt the groups away en route to follow them to other destinations for a price. Private landowners, notably individuals like Grasalkovich, Antal Grasalkovich, for example, in the 1740s, 50s, and 60s, but leading local Hungarian families, the Erdődy and others, tempted these migrants who had been recruited by Vienna for the settlement of the Banat away onto their private estates. So only half the original group moving with Magdalena Wagner held out against the strain of the journey and the traffickers' constant pestering, and the other 4 families with her, convinced by the stories told them of Ottoman threats and of the terrible climate to the east, ended their journey and settled in the territories through which they were crossing. By now, there were only 4 families remaining with Magdalena Wagner, and they continue by foot to Hungary. Nevertheless, on their way, they encounter another 11 traffickers attempting to move them further, some as far away as Transylvania. And when they finally rested at the tavern Zum Goldenen Lamm in Buda, all but Wagner now succumbed to temptation and accepted the prospects offered them by other Hungarian agents. Even the trafficker escorting Wagner left with another trafficker. So Magdalena Wagner alone, the sole survivor of the original group of 26, continued on foot to the Hungarian Banat. And Wagner's report describing the greedy and deceitful traffickers who operated with abandon, who misled and misdirected the migrants and destroyed their dream of remaining together, sat in Vienna unopened. It was never even opened by the officials to whom she had sent it. So in brief, it was this perception of a better opportunity, of a new beginning, a desire to improve and to succeed, which prompted the decision to uproot and to seek a new life in Pennsylvania or in Hungary. And it's the decision and its immediate aftermath that lies at the heart of my book. An individual or a family's commitment to uproot and transplant abroad was rarely made on the spur of the moment in the 18th century or today, but it was almost always made as the result of the promotional energies of a recruiter or a trafficker, a woman or more usually a man who had been abroad and returned home to share the story of success. Where bold text, printed leaflets and pamphlets declared the possibility on offer abroad, be that in Pennsylvania, in Carolina, in Hungary, Russia or elsewhere, a trafficker, fresh returned, gave comforting accent to the printed High German abstractions. He or she would parse and phrase in a way that made the foreign sound familiar and the strange seem exotic and interesting. So the human trafficker dared to flout laws and regulations, emboldened by the liberties secured abroad, to return home and share in his success. And this trafficker bribed and badgered, he sang and he swore, all in the name of encouraging others to follow in his path, suggesting that this was the granting of freedom, but in reality making Kopfgeld or making head money for every migrant he brought with him. No more the drudgery of old Germany, they would say. New, free lands awaited for willing migrants to plant and to populate. Yet, as you've seen, the process could also be a dangerous one, made even more so by the cunning and guile of these speculators in hope, these migrant escorts and traffickers whose actions earned them so many derogatory names. At very best, these individuals were Neuländer. They were men and women who had made the trip abroad at least once, or at least purported to have done so, and who now sought to gain from assisting others to relocate. At worst, they took payment for a journey that they did not see through to the very end, as with the agent coming with Magdalena Wagner, leaving naive, poor, and frequently ill people, who were illiterate too, to fend for themselves in foreign languages and in foreign lands. And that was the fate of the passengers aboard the Francis and Elizabeth in Philadelphia in 1749. Refused permission to offload its sick and dying migrants, the ship does not feature on the list of vessels which docked in the port of Philadelphia that year. There's no official register of the ship at all, and no record survives of even one of the passengers. The hundreds of migrants aboard were ill prepared for the arduous journey. They were misinformed by the agents to whom they had paid money in Rotterdam, and they were left to fail at the very last step in the journey to America, confined to the lazaretto where they likely died, or from where they were returned to Europe. So it's the Neuländer trafficker VDW that Leonhard Melchior in his text blames for the plights of the migrant. And it was also the fate of the families who traveled with Magdalena Wagner to Hungary, lured away from their set path by rival agents competing to win settlers for lands along the way. Wagner alone dared continue in the face of their provocations and threats. Were it not for the letters written by Melchior and Wagner, condemning the mistreatment of German migrants by these soul sellers, these Seelenverkäufer, we'd know nothing at all of their actions. In both cases, all that survives are the reports of the damning actions of the recruiters who gained handsomely by selling these migrants their dreams of a better life, and by doing so sold their souls in the hope of a much brighter future. Or let's take the case of one other, Johannes Judy, one of my favorites. This a little ad for the settlement of the Banat, for example. These were published and distributed throughout the German Rhineland at this time. Johannes Judy. When in 1751 Johannes Judy returned from Philadelphia to his village of Frankendorf in northern Switzerland, the 25-year-old man was dressed resplendently, and he showed no signs of his older trade as a cooper. To his friends and neighbors, he appeared a young man who had been successful enough to traverse continents and sail the seas, and who now returned to share the secret of his good fortune with his kinsfolk and neighbors in Switzerland. The Newlander from America was absolutely conspicuous in his appearance and in his enthusiasm for his life abroad. And we know what he looked like because we have his arrest warrant. Judy was arrested and charged with inciting others to illegally leave the canton. His arrest warrant then, and the documentation that he left all along the Rhine and across the Atlantic concerning his behavior, tell us much about the life of these agents and traffickers at the time. 6 feet tall, 1.83 meters, with a broad, ruddy, well-formed face. He was quite tall for his age. He had long, blonde, curly hair, and his arrest warrant reported that only his broad frame hinted at his years of manual labor. After just 2 years in Pennsylvania, the judge wrote, the young man had returned an American, and he used the word macaroni, which you may know from the nursery rhyme Yankee Doodle. Yeah? He was an Angeber. He was a trickster. He was a pretender. Wearing long blue city trousers. Blue was not legal for a man of his status in the canton of Bern at this time. He was wearing white stockings and city shoes, and he was carrying a small knife. Judy became the talk of his village and surrounding area, and his stories of limitless land and bread, of freedom and success, of comfort and prosperity, found welcome audiences wherever he went. Here was a man who had left illiterate and penniless, and who returned looking like a gentleman, carrying a pocket watch, now commanding respect and attention and dropping English words into his conversation whenever he spoke. Over the course of the next 20 years, Johannes Judy would travel back and forth across the Atlantic at least 6 times, and he would organize the transportation of his extended family, recruit their neighbors and others from many villages in the canton of Basel, and he was responsible ultimately for moving perhaps as many as 9,000 people from the Swiss cantons and Germany to America. So he moves them all along this river system, controlling this, largely operating with shipping agents in Rotterdam, taking these individuals back, and depending on how many people he accompanies with him to Rotterdam in March, April, or May, he receives Kopfgeld, money for every head he moves. Now, I don't have time to go into what I've done, but I've used a software system called Gephi, perhaps some of you are familiar with, which is described as Facebook for historians. And Gephi is an intelligent software system that allows you feed in information about individuals, then map it with GPS technology, and figure out if there are connections of any kinds. And so what I did with everybody on Judy's vessel in 1751, all 506 people, was go back to the church records in Switzerland, trace everybody, and reconstruct the entire vessel of individuals, and then look at how they were related. And in essence, Johannes Judy is in the middle here. And practically everybody, 96% of the individuals on the vessel, are in one way or another connected with him, or are connected in some form of social capital. That's the Judy family in red, the direct family. But then we have lines of godparenting, and intermarriage or marriage with others in neighboring towns and villages. Then we have those that left legally or illegally with money. So did they leave legally or illegally? We find that the vast majority leave illegally with large amounts of money, dowries and so forth. Quite a wealthy group. And then that's just an interesting looking one that I did in a different color. But more importantly, what we find is that on vessels, and what I haven't said is that one set of records we have from 1717 to 1775 is a register for the Port of Philadelphia of every German male over the age of 16 who arrives in the port. And that's because under the new Hanoverian king, George I, he extends the right of German migrants to move to Pennsylvania. But this register is only of men over the age of 16. It accounts for about 60% of all the Germans entering the port. And what I found was that on these lists, a lot of the names at the bottom are in fact women. So by reconstructing the voyages, one can see that A. Wagner, S. Schmidt, M. Becker is in fact a woman, and that they're women of status, and that in fact the register is signed in terms of hierarchy and status as people get off the ship. So it's not random at all. It's possible to prove this, not just with one vessel, but I've done this with 30 ships in the mid-century. So these are incredibly organized social systems. So having spent less than 2 years then in Pennsylvania, Judy returned, as I say, to Switzerland in '51, nominally to visit his relatives, but also acting as a courier, carrying letters back to Switzerland. And when he appeared in the canton of Basel, Judy's return alerted the Basel and Bern authorities to his presence in the region. Basel had followed in the footsteps of Zurich and Bern in forbidding immigration to America in 1748-49, and they had issued a decree in 1749 which outlined the consequences of such an action. Individuals could be arrested, put in the Hexenturm in the Witches' Tower, or even executed if they were workers with lace, if they were highly skilled workers. So it's interesting that in the reissuing of the decree in 1773, later in the century, the word Newlander, or return migrant, is used interchangeably with the word Werber, with the word recruiter or advertiser. So as I've said, an arrest warrant was issued for Judy, and he managed to escape the grasp of the authorities, leaving in 1751 with his sister Elizabeth, with his brother and with his cousins. Judy makes the journey back 3 more times. His final journey is in 1767, and in that year it's officially to come back to find a second wife, a very common cause for men to come back from Hungary or from North America to find wives. On one of his vessels in 66, he brings back about 40 unmarried women to push into the marriage market in Pennsylvania. But in 1767, his trip back to Basel caused something of a consternation, and it led to a whole new series of debates and exchanges. Judy sails from Rotterdam in 67 back to Pennsylvania, to Philadelphia, and he arrives in the port on the 10th of November 67. And this is a German language newspaper that was originally established by Benjamin Franklin in Philadelphia, the so-called Philadelphische Staatsbode, later called Miller's Zeitung. And a small text appears shortly after the Sally, the ship with Judy, lands in Philadelphia in 1767, under the title Klage über einen bösen Neuländer, complaint about a bad Newlander, a trafficker. And this ad, or this advertisement, was signed by 3 men on behalf of all of the German migrants aboard the vessel, and presents an entirely interesting text about what was happening. In brief, I'm not going to translate all of it for you, fear not, but what we find is that these 3 men, Johannes Senner, Henner Simonsen and Johannes Baumann, write that Judy has deceived them all, not least because he claims that he had his mother with him again. So he entered villages, said, "My mother is coming with me." He had this elderly woman with him, that he purported to be a great religious man, and that half the people aboard the ship knew him to be a priest, because in their villages he had come dressed as a Catholic priest into the village. They say further in this text that 5 men had in fact been forced to undertake the trip because Judy had heard their confession and had then blackmailed them with what they had told him. So here we have somebody who's using a whole range of different tricks to do this. And you would imagine that Judy is going to just leave it there, not complain. But oh no, Judy decides to fight back in print. And just 3 months later, in a Baltimore newspaper, Baltimore Town, this is published in February 68, Der seine Ehre rettende Neuländer, the Newlander or the trafficker who seeks to save his reputation or his honor. And he begins wonderfully with a biblical quotation. He begins, Wahrheit und Unwahrheit. Truth and falsehood are 2 different things. We Germans pronounce falsehood with 1 word, a lie in the plural lies. Christ, the voice of truth, says in John chapter 8, and he goes on to quote John. And then, in an exhaustive text, he effectively takes apart the 3 men who had published the letter. He starts talking about their immorality. He describes them as being, one of them as being cuckolded by his wife. His wife has left him for another on the ship. He suggests that another is homosexual, and he describes another as a thief who had to flee Europe. And this in exhaustive detail. I could go on and on and on, all the way down to the end until he signs the text. Yeah? He also makes the kind of the particular insult that one of these individuals is a secret Catholic, ein Katholischer, which of course is not permitted in Philadelphia at all, and leads to Johannes Sen being arrested to see if he is in fact a Catholic. He's forced to take Anglican communion in front of the governor of Pennsylvania at that stage. The 3 men fight back, and this is what makes it a very interesting story, and they push back with another text. And what I want to draw to a conclusion with is that they publish the text of a ballad or a song. And this is the only example of this we have in the German language for the 18th century. It's incredible to have found it. But they published the text of an advertising song that they say Judy had printed in Basel and Bern and distributed, and that people would sing. And the text is wonderful because in part it's in dialect. So it's in local dialect as you go on. Jetzt geht es an ein Schiffen ein, and so on. Now we're going on a ship. From Bern we are going. All of the things we can do. Was soll ich sagen, seien's Galorin oder nicht? This word is kind of classic Basel, that we're all lads, we're all boys that can go together. This is going to be a great adventurous life. We're going to move on. And then what I like most of all in this text is, if you read this, and this took ages to, in my own mind, to figure out, Drum nimm ein observation. He works an English word into this. Now take an observation. Now let me make an observation. Du Babeljungen alt. He's showing his exoticism. He's showing his ability to actually work a foreign language into this text, which is really quite impressive, that he wants to show his skill. He wants to show his ability to do this. Du Babeljungen alt, nur einzusehen Amerika bald, because we will soon see America. Zur Schand sein Christen nicht, was man von wilden Sicht, ja nicht mit Liebe eingericht, and so on. So this was sung, was promoted. He had all of these things at his disposal. So I've only given in this presentation a hint at some of the richness of the sources that are there for the 17th, 18th century, looking at these individuals. But I hope that it's clear that as the fashion for immigration grew in Europe after the great depopulation and general upheavals of the 30 Years' War, so did this proclivity of migrant traffickers. It was virtually impossible, I think, in the 17th and 18th century in Europe to contemplate immigration either to Eastern Europe or across the Atlantic without coming under the influence of an agent or a trafficker. These individuals worked both as private enterprises and they worked for state and for other agencies. They were densely packed throughout the territories. I have examples of agents for Hungary, Russia, and America finding each other in the same village and having boxing matches where they're all competing for the same people. And this rivalry led to an increase in and further exaggeration of the literature produced about America in particular and about opportunities for life abroad more generally. Recruiters, these agents, these traffickers, were keenly aware which aspects of life abroad to highlight and to exaggerate. Everything that incensed individuals about life in the old world could be compared to and contrasted with the new. Migrants, I think, could only conceive of a better life abroad by associating it with the social, economic, and religious landscape that they left behind. And this was already sufficiently boring, but I have one chapter in the book which is about the theory of non-knowledge and how, in fact, this ties into ideas about risk or decision-making and how one makes decisions in the absence of information. How do you judge the validity of information when you're faced with different individuals telling you that America is there or America is there? Where is America when you're in a village? So the dream of a new world was sold as a corrective to the drudgery of existence at home. Traffickers spoke of a life abroad festooned with unlimited hunting rights, freedom from military service, religious toleration, limitless land, and abundant food. And to this extent, a migrant recruiter's success depended on his ability to recognize a particular region's shortcomings and thereby to stress how life abroad would be better and different. There was no room in this market for taciturn or shy individuals. Recruiters combined human resource management skills, as we'd call it today, with oral sales techniques, all wrapped up in showmanship and delivered, importantly, in a familiar local accent or dialect. Traffickers then emerged as a network of businessmen and women who engaged in the transportation of migrants largely as a supplementary profession, principally to subsidize or to meet the full costs of passage to and from their home, but also as a means of turning a profit, and usually in such an underhand business of acquiring a reputation. I think what was important here was the social capital element of this as well as the financial capital. Some, certainly not all, appear to have sought the notoriety through their actions. Judy liked the person he became. He became this showman. He became this merchant in exoticism. And what's even more exciting, I think, is the fact that the watch he carried didn't work. He writes frequently that the watch is broken. So this idea of a timelessness of exoticism. Such fame served a number of recruiters well, gained them new contracts for the raising of further migrants. One of these, for example, recruits individuals from North America, then for Catherine the Great's Black Sea settlements, Novoserbska, with the movement of a large number of people from the military frontier in the 1760s. These agents can move all around, recruiting for different areas. And some traffickers simply disappeared into the fog of history, as they do today, covering over their footprints and leaving little or no trace. The traffickers who worked freelance or on one-off contracts with Rotterdam or Danube shipping agents were often much more ruthless than those who worked a number of times. By their very actions, though, these traffickers were living proof, as in the words of Melchior, that, quote, "Whoever goes to Pennsylvania as a servant shall be a gentleman, as a maid shall become a lady, who goes as a farmer shall be a nobleman, as a commoner a tradesman, all shall become barons." Traffickers, finally, I think also bridged a gap between literacy and illiteracy, and between languages. Unable to read the mass of literature on the world beyond Germany, or to read at all, many Germans were a willing audience for these traffickers telling stories of the colonial experience. The role emerged and grew in importance because of their access, real or perceived, to information about opportunities abroad. And more than this, these traffickers took advantage of a lack of knowledge about abroad, about opportunities, about how to reach America or Hungary or elsewhere, about what to take with them on the trip, how much it would cost, what to say, and what to do on arrival. With the beginnings of the migrant trade in the 17th century, an emergent zeitgeist came to see ignorance as a commodity, a new understanding of the value, both political and economic, of vague threats and incalculable risk for whoever sought to gain from unsuccessfully providing solutions to inscrutable problems. So traffickers needed ignorance just as much as they needed knowledge. They preyed on the non-knowledge of would-be migrants, supplying them with information and disinformation at a cost. Ignorance has many interesting surrogates in the world of the philosophy of information, and it overlaps with both secrecy and stupidity, with censorship and disinformation, with faith and with forgetfulness. These traffickers then needed to control the flow and supply of information about life abroad. If too much information were freely available, then prospective migrants would have no need for traffickers and the secrets they retailed. Traffickers were purveyors of ignorance just as much as they were purveyors of information and knowledge. Migrant recruiters and traffickers then, the individuals at the focus of this book, are traders in the marketplace of cultures of knowing and not knowing, supplying the materials with which to dream and then make the dream of a better life a reality. Traffickers bridged, as they do today, divides in geography, in literacy and illiteracy, in economic security and insecurity, in freedom and in servitude. And they were scoundrels and saviors in differing measures, at different times and in different places. Quite simply, though, without their actions, the entire process of early modern migration would have been inconceivable. And as such, the traffickers of the early modern, I argue, laid the groundwork for subsequent mass migration in the age of steam in the 19th and 20th centuries, and indeed even today. Thank you very much.
It's a tiny question maybe, but I was intrigued by the word macaroni that you used, especially when you replace it in the context of that song that you showed us. And I was wondering if it's not just simply related to macaronism. So linguistic, the fact that you imbue your native language with the other language that you speak, and basically it's a bastard language, so I guess this would be very offensive at the time for German ears, this practice of mixed language. And I was wondering, are there any, I don't know, text or articles related to the language of this Newlanders, or how does it, because this mix of German and English, has it been commented upon? That's it.
I mean, this idea of the individual, so it becomes particular to the colonial American experience, where the idea of the macaroni works its way in through German migrants into colonial North American English in the 1730s. So originally, Anglo settlers referred to Germans as macaroni because they're pretending to be speakers. Franklin writes in the 1740s about Germans thinking they can speak English, but of course they can't because they're not intelligent enough, as he says, an essay in 1746. But what's interesting is that the idea of the macaroni then comes back into English society. So, as you know, that nursery rhyme, Yankee Doodle went to town riding on a pony, stuck a feather in his hat and called it macaroni. Okay? That's first used in the 1740s in London about these nouveau riche coming back from the colonies who don't know how to behave as English gentlemen, but they have lots of money. And so they start in the 1740s for the first time, English writers to talk about the skin color of these people who purport to be English coming back, that they're tanned, that their clothes are a decade out of fashion, and that they don't know what the new words are, and that they're speaking like colonists. And some historians of the 18th century Americas have highlighted that as the moment in which there's a cultural breach between the metropole and the periphery. That once you begin to see a distinction between those who want to be English and those who say they are not English, that it's significant. There's been no work that I'm aware of specifically on the question of Anglo-German or the German language in the 18th century in America looking at this. Linguists interested in that subject typically look at dialect usage. So looking at the survival of Felsish amongst Mennonites or Amish, or looking at various dialectical Mundart survivals, but nothing specifically at this. And I think it's a great subject.
On the other hand, well, this Creole, Macaronism, well, all these very mixed linguistic practices were very common. If you were in Kushit, well, Kushit doesn't exist at the time. If you were in Kashau or Kashau, then you would hear people talking with, like, a sentence would be with Latin, German, Hungarian words, maybe Slavic words.
So this is exactly the same. There's an entire mixture that's recorded for this period. And in the Caribbean we have it, so we know lots of evidence from Caribbean society, even the Bahian coast, where you've got mixtures of Ashanti languages and Portuguese and other indigenous Tupi-Aymara languages. But there's nothing specifically on this.
I would like to ask you especially about East Central European dimension of German migration. As we know, in the 17th century, it was not the first wave of German migrants into this territory. So what was the relation between the old Germans coming, for example, in the 13th century, settled in many towns, and then the new Germans coming in the 17th or 18th century?
In effect, many of the areas which were being settled for the which are being settled now after 1683, 89, Passarowitz after 1718, they're being settled by Germans for the first time. And these German colonists are being moved onto land and are being directed away from urban settlements. So one of the great fears of Vienna, already in 1726, I mean, it really picks up in the 1740s under Maria Theresa, is that these colonists are going to see what Vienna is like and want to stay there. Or they're going to see what Graz is like and want to stay there. And that we're not going to get them onto the land. And so one of the reasons why Wiener Neustadt is developed as a port on the Danube is to not allow people into the city. We move people around to Baden by Wien. We move them all overland rather than let them see areas. I mean, there are many dimensions to the question you ask. I think, in essence, the earlier migrants, if we think going into, in general, places like Transylvania and so on, there's Leckers and others that move Saxons, Transylvanian Saxons, or into the Boetzenland or into other places. They're moving very much as Miles Christiani. I mean, they're seen as Christian colonizers, and they're going with that mentality. They have very little to do with the new migrants. And in those areas where, for example, the small Transylvanian Saxon villages where some migrants do move, very few in the 18th century, there are repeated tensions, not least because many of the earlier Saxons have become or are Calvinists or are Lutherans, and these new migrants are almost predominantly Catholics. So it's certainly the intention of the state, and I argue that this is a form of colonization. You know, after 1718, the Banat is not restored to the Hungarian nobles who own it. It's declared a neo-Christicus. Under Roman law, it's declared the booty property of the emperor. And so he refuses to acknowledge title, and he colonizes it as if it were a space in the Americas, I would argue. I mean, he plants it with Spaniards, with Neapolitans, with Milanese, with Swedes, with lots of Germans.
The question is, how did these guys choose their choose their target audience, let's say, or their communities that they would go to? You said that most of them are Catholics, so did they go to places where Catholics were minorities, or did they go to places that were particularly desperate or hard hit by the 30 Years' War, or some other factors that they chose?
I gave a similar talk to this in Hamburg, where I'd been an Erasmus student a number of months ago. And they said, well, you keep talking about Germans, but this isn't Germany. Germany is up here, you know? And of course, I mean, another part of this story is that this is about Germany before the 19th century. And this is about a river system Germany which is Rhine and Danube. It's not just the Danubian monarchy, in Robert Evans' terms. It's not just the old Rhine, but this is Germany. And the migrants up here, and there are lots and lots of people, are so-called Fußgänger-Migranten. So these are pedestrian migrants who are engaged frequently in, there are lots of terms in northern Germany for this, but Kachelleger, they're tile makers, they're individuals who move up and down to Denmark, or they operate in the Baltic area, or even in the Low Countries, but they're operating in a completely different system. They're operating in large part, where possible, outside of the Reich, outside of the empire. And I think one of the frustrations, not all of it, that's important to say, but you know, the fewer number of people who are recruited up here doesn't mean that people up there didn't migrate. They migrated in a different network, in smaller number. My argument would be that this is also a story about Germany that's been forgotten in the 19th century. It's a story of pre- and post-1806 Germany, a pre- and post-1871 Germany, which has much more to do with the change in understanding of who controls German history. The historiographical moment, I think, after Ranke as well, has a part to play in this story. Your question about religious targeting, I did say that the majority of people moving down here are Catholic, but not all. And one of the kind of classic cliches of the literature is that only Catholics move to Southeastern Europe, only Protestants move to North America. It's not true. It's about 75% dominant in each way, but it's not at all the case. Under Charles VI, under Maria Theresa and Francis Stephen, they didn't particularly care if people were Lutherans or not, as long as they formed the Militärgrenze with the empire. So we find lots of Lutheran communities moving as well. Just to say how they targeted, typically they simply moved along the river systems that were relevant to their movement. So most of the Southeastern European people followed the river systems of the Danube. These followed the river systems of the Rhine, but this area recruited for both. So Ulm is a stopping point for the movement into Hungary, but it's also a stopping point for many of the Swiss and others moving up the Rhine. And that's where we had most violence, typically in March, April, May, when people were on the move. That's where we had fisticuffs, battles between them.
And you told there were both men and women traffickers. So I would like to hear more about female traffickers. I was wondering if there were, for example, different strategies of recruiting people. You told us about the fake mother, which was very successful. I
had really hoped, and all the way through the study, I'd hoped to uncover equal numbers or more women, or to show that there was some dynamic which might be particular here. The only place where there are more women than men is, it's not even here, but in Rotterdam. And so for many of the individuals who made it on their own to Rotterdam, who traveled up, who found their own way, they went through 38 different tax stations if they left Basel. By the time they got there, they had to pay tax at each one of these or move overland and avoid it. By the time they get to Rotterdam, that's where the last free migrants are captured, because what they realize is they cannot get on a ship. No ship's captain will allow them aboard unless they go through an agent. And that's because they don't want free individuals. They want people to be in groups under the control of someone. And so there's a wonderful Dutch work by somebody called Mark van Alpen about 25 years ago called The Female Side of the VOC Trade. So he was looking at recruiting for the Dutch East India Company. And basically tavern keepers, the majority were women in Rotterdam. And they open lines of credit. And they will tell people that no ship is going for another month, you've got no money, we'll give you credit. You get everything from clothes, food, alcohol, prostitutes, everything I've seen credit given for on these. And then the tavern keeper sells the bond. I should have explained that there's a pun of sorts. So seal in Dutch, C-E-E-L, In German, Anleihe is a bond. And it puns with the Dutch word Ziel, which in German is Seele. And so a Seelenverkäufer is a Zielverkoper, a bond seller. And so you're both selling someone's credit bond, but you're selling their soul. And that's how it becomes a type of homophone, I suppose you would say, a word that sounds the same, works across. So it begins really as something about selling your credit. And what that means is that the majority of these individuals become indentured servants. So their bond is 5 to 7 years, which means they can't get off the ship on the other side unless somebody buys them. And that's why in the early years of indentured servitude, life expectancy for indentured servants was lower than for enslaved Africans. Because there's no incentive in having another German become free after 5 or 7 years, because he's then going to compete with you.
I was wondering whether you came across Jewish traffickers, because these, well, I'm more modern historian, so for me there's this whole Jewish trafficking stuff with Galicia and, you know, the borders of late Habsburg Empire. So I was wondering whether you had found some.
One of the sources I use most, obviously, are letters that are sent back from migrants from both directions. But the problem with most of the letters we have is that they exist in German archives largely because they never got to the people for whom they were intended. If you know what I mean, if you think about it, the reason why they survive is because they were confiscated. So you have to ask, how useful are they as sources of information? Did people really know this? And when many letters were not reaching people, two theories emerged already in the 1730s and 40s. One was that the English Board of Trade was stopping negative information coming back, and that's true. So the Board of Trade had a censorship office in London. It would rewrite some of the German letters saying, come over, it's great, fantastic, you know, it's kind of Disneyland, avant la lettre. And then the other rumor was that Sephardic Jews in Rotterdam were rewriting letters. And that was completely untrue. But there's a wonderful article by Georg Fertig called, it's in, I can give you the full reference, but it's called Der mit dem Judenspieß. So it was an allegation that was being made already in the 1730s that the Jews of Rotterdam were negatively controlling, or were controlling the information going back. Now on the other side, in Hungary, what's much more interesting, and one Israeli scholar, Anat Peri, has done a little bit of work on this, Jewish merchants along the Militärgrenze and further north, so along the military frontier, were operating victualling stations for migrants. And so many of the migrants were actually being assisted en route, or being sold goods, depending on how you see it, en route, by both Sephardic and small numbers of Ashkenazi communities. And there we have tension between Ashkenazi and Sephardim who are encountering each other for the first time. So that leads to interesting debates, for example, about Subotica, Sobotka, and the center of Jewish learning that emerges there already in the mid-18th century. But because of the opening up of the frontier, you have these two communities encountering each other, arguing about ritual practice, and really, really difficult times. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah,
please.
You mentioned migrant.
Yeah.
That's how this longish conflict with Prussia influenced the image of
Great.
German immigration.
Thank you. Originally, the title of one of the chapters was Silesia of the South. Yeah. But then the publisher said nobody would know what that meant. So that, that changed. My argument was that really as a result of the War of Austrian Succession, the intensive attempts to settle Banat, Bachka, Bukovina and so on began as a result specifically of the loss of most of Silesia. And so particularly after 41 with the loss of Breslau, Wroclaw, there's an attempt to actually conceive of Temeshwara, as a type of Wroclaw, Breslau of the south, and to see the Banat as an area like this. I mean, for me, you know, some of the people I became most obsessed with in this story were the small communities of Catalans and Valencians who were moved after 1711-12, loyalists to Charles, who left Spain with him, and who then end up, you know, Voltaire in his History of Europe, writes that it was easier to navigate Vienna in the 1720s and 30s speaking Castilian than it was speaking German, because there's about 25,000 Spanish refugees, Catalans, Valencians. By the 1730s, Charles can't afford to pay these anymore, and so he pushes them into Hungary. And we have villages like OReilly, Barcelona, New Barcelona, where we have mulberry trees, silk industry established. And these are all wiped out in 1736 with the new Turkish wars. So in the 40s, again, after Halberstein and going into Kaunitz and the Kaunitzian reforms in the early 60s, there's certainly an attempt to see southern Hungary as the new Galicia. But it's not quite so successful because of Serbian opposition. Another story.
I certainly have a question. As it was already mentioned here, the parallels with the medieval settling processes are striking and sort of offer themselves. I think that for the medieval, what is so-called medieval colonization, we are pretty sure what the legal frame was, but we, I would say, lack individual stories. So I think this is particularly intriguing that for the later centuries you are able to recover so many individual stories. And I was maybe also in the parallel with the medieval processes, sort of contemplating on the role of this promise of new land, available land, and how it changed over time. Obviously later in the 19th century with the processes of urbanization, industrialization, we could say that other commodities in addition to land were becoming more attractive. And I had one question, because of course in the Americas this supposedly available land was often described as virgin land, and I'm wondering how it was described in the Balkans, the land from which the Ottoman Empire gradually receded. So that would be one question, and the other would be what else in addition to land was marketed for the labor of the people? What, if you think, what was maybe not equally but very importantly prominent in addition to promising but available new land to the people?
In the first iteration, in the first presentation of this process in the 1680s, so you have already under Leopold the so-called Einrichtungswerk, the reconstitution of parts of these territories that have been taken back from the Ottoman Empire. We're talking here about the historic crown lands of St. Stephen to the south of Bohemia, so in particular Hungary and northern Croatia and so on. The model that we're using in the 1680s, the first patent issued for colonization is 1689, is the medieval one. So it goes back. You could close your eyes and imagine that it's Walter van der Vogelweide or Hartmann von Au, or it's one of the high medieval German Mittelhoch writers who's selling the same idea. Come, be a Christian soldier on the frontier, there is land to be taken, the infidel need to be controlled, and then immediately a counter-argument emerges, which is the term Deutscher Friedhof, so the idea of Ungarn, Hungary as a German graveyard. Okay? So that's both a negative aspect, but it's a positive reinforcer of the idea that what you're doing is being a soldier for Christ. That doesn't last very long. It's a very tempting opportunity. And already by the early 1700s, it's really 1712, there are small settlements in places like Boli and elsewhere in Hungary in the first decade, but it's really 1712 that it picks up. And at that stage, it is almost entirely about relief from taxation and relief for military service. And also one of the things that's most desired is pannage, estivers, the right to actually use common land, to use the forests. I mean, if we think all into the early 20th century, we still have so-called potato wars and so on going on. This is about access to common land and freedom. So people settling in the Banat or in southern Hungary are granted initially 5, then 10 years freedom of taxation. They're given a house. They are told that if they move, they can move entire villages. So there are villages from Alsace, Lorraine, Lothringen that are constituted entirely as they were. You live beside your neighbours as you did before, if they all move. And so there's an element of reconstituting the familiar But of course, the problem, insofar as it's a problem, is that we're told this is empty land, it's terra nullius. But there are people living there. You know? There are lots of people, Wallachians, Proto-Romanians, if you like, and many, many others. And they're displaced. And this is a story, too, about the displacement of indigenous populations. In particular, the displacement of Roma communities in huge numbers. There's a very good Austrian historian called Stefan Steiner, who's working on this at the moment. But this is missing in the official literature in Vienna. So if one reads this narrative, what's most striking for me as a comparative historian is that it's exactly like reading the literature Europeans write about being in the Americas. There is nobody there, except there are people there. And Europeans want what they called old fields in America. They don't just want any land, they want the fields that have been used by Native Americans, which they call old fields. There's no suggestion that anyone used them before, but that's the point. And so what does change over the course of the 18th century is any suggestion that this is about defending the Heimat or defending the Reich. That vanishes, that's gone by the 20s. What we have is really ideas about liberty, freedom from military service, certain amounts of religious freedom in some places, and really there is no difference. This is what disappoints many Americanists. They say, but the Germans who came to North America were better, really, weren't they? I get asked that a lot. They must have been self-selecting and they knew it was going to be a better place. Well, the reality is, 7 times as many people moved into southeastern Europe because it was a better place, because it was closer, because the land was typically more familiar, and you didn't have the threat of the French or Native Americans, because the Ottoman threat had really receded for most of this time. Yes, there were wars every now and then, but not as there had been. And so that's a challenge in the mindset of many Americanists as well, that they don't really like. And there are movements of people unfree to southeastern Europe as well. If you think of the so-called Temeshwar Wasserschub, the push by water, organized by Maria Theresa in the 1750s, where she moves the prostitutes of Vienna to the frontier. She moves them down to become wives for the Grenzer, for people along the frontier. So there's unfreedom going in both directions, really.